Thank you for listening to Mobility Redefined, brought to you by Modaxo. For more insights and information, please visit mobilityredefined.com. That is mobilityredefined.com. Welcome to the Mobility Redefined podcast, where we explore innovative strategies together with the leaders of urban mobility from different countries. I am your host, Dr. Kaan Yildizgoz, and today I am delighted to be joined by Mr. Edwins Mukabanah, Managing Director of Kenya Bus Service Management Limited. Actually, Mr. Mukabanah, Edwins, I will call from now on as Edwins, is pioneer in African public transport, and we know each other nearly 20 years. And each of my discussion with him, I learned a lot about his experience in different countries, including in UK for operating the buses, and as well in multiple countries in Africa. And I'm very pleased that Mr. Mukabanah is joining us today to share his experiences about running public transport, mainly focusing in African countries. Edwins, welcome to Mobility Redefined.
Thank you for hosting me. Thank you, Ben.
It's a big pleasure, and I'm very sure that many of our listeners, they will be enjoying a lot to tune into this edition of the podcast. So let's start discussing a little bit about yourself and your previous experience. You have more than 40 years of experience in mobility. Could you share your personal journey? What inspired you to enter the sector, and how is it shaped your vision for mobility for Africa?
Thank you very much. I joined public transport in 1984 after finishing University of Nairobi. And I started, first of all, working with a company which was UK-based. It used to be called United Transport Overseas Services, which owned two city bus operations, and it also had an intercity operation. They also operated a ferry, and they also operated a tour company. So I worked with them for a long time. During that time, I did a lot on parcels. I also did a lot on human resource management. I traveled to UK after Stagecoach came to Kenya, and therefore I managed to work with Stagecoach. Here, also a bit of work in Malawi. I also did a bit of consultancies with Swedrail. And then I left Kenya Bus and joined Stagecoach in UK. But before that, I went to UK to study transport at University of Westminster. And since then, I came back and I've been doing advocacy and talking about transport for many years. But I have the experience public transport operation, public transport management, and I also then know public transport policy at policy level. I influence a lot what happens in the country, Kenya, especially on matters public transport.
That's a perfect experience. And then maybe if we talk about your current company, KBS, Kenya Bus Services, I know that you have a unique business model where individually owned buses operate under an organized structure. That's how I remember when I was visiting you some years ago in Nairobi, even when I was visiting your depot there. Could you explain how this model works, why it has been effective in the Nairobi's context?
The model works very well because it has been very difficult to operate big companies in Kenya. Therefore, paratransits have taken over. At one point, the company that we used to run called Kenya Bus Service, which was owned by a UK company and later on operated by Stagecoach, could not compete, and therefore it collapsed. And after that company collapsed, I came with a new idea. I had just come from UK. I had looked at how United Express works. So I decided to form a company based on a franchising model, where we invite the paratransit operators to operate under our franchise. That is, then we manage to give them the delivery. We make sure they're using our ticketing system. They are operating on our license routes. They are conforming to particular standards of operation. Therefore, we are in charge of setting the standards of how they are going to operate. Now, this was very good because before we hadn't had an aggregator model. So with a place where you have so many operators, you need somebody to aggregate that. And we did it as a private company. But later on, the government decided to create cooperatives. So they decided to ask now every individual aggregator to form a cooperative. So they started working now as cooperatives. The model has taken root in the licensing regime with the National Transport and Safety Authority. And now that's the model that is working. The cooperative model is still having challenges, and I see now the government talking about reverting back to a limited company operation, but the aggregator model is still being now refined, and I think it is the one that is going to take the day.
And I mean, in this both, like say, like when you work directly with the individuals or when you work with the cooperatives, how you were sharing the roles between your company and them? Who was, for example, taking the commercial risk? So was it your company, KBS, or them? So that's
Both of us are licensed. The cooperative and the limited company are licensed by NTSA as operators. So we are allowed to aggregate. Then we are given special routes to operate. Of course, the worst part of it is that we compete in the route, and we do not have a situation where we are competing for routes. So one of the things that we are now asking is, can we now compete for routes so that we can have maybe gross contracts and therefore try to operate now on scheduled service? That is where we're heading. We are also trying to see how we can aggregate ourselves and see if we can operate even within the BRT framework.
it's very interesting. And also when we talk about this aggregation, corporatization of the individually owned and operated buses, it brings me the discussion about matatus, certainly, and even wider framework like informal versus formal transport in Africa. It's maybe the most important discussion. Whenever I go Africa, which is very frequently, I was in Abidjan recently, and then I was discussing with them. We were doing an innovation workshop as Mobility Redefined in Abidjan, and then we were discussing about this aspect as well. And my question is that in matatus, I mean, in Kenya, for those who are not knowing, it's like individually owned and operated minibuses. But it's a very strong culture in Kenya. And they remain central to the Nairobi's transport, but often operate outside formal structures. How do you see the balance between these informal and formal systems evolving? So maybe you can share experience around this also, that what you are doing with the matatus. Maybe as KBS or what the authority is doing there.
Yes, tools are paratransit operators. And being paratransit operators, they come with all the problems that are related to paratransit, the externalities that go with matatus, which I think we'll talk about later. But there is a lot of need to cooperatize and make sure that the matatus move from transition from the current operations to a more modern one, more formal one. But we don't see this as a complete change. I think we'll have to have both. We shall have a bit of matatus, which are the informal operators, and we shall start asking or watching for bigger bus operators, bringing them together to be able to formalize and cooperatize their operations so that we start getting the bus service standards as the ones you have maybe in Istanbul or the ones you have in Brussels. That is our feeling. We are lucky that there are a lot of organizations that are coming in to assist. The European Union, for example, is coming in to look at one of the BRT lines. We have JICA trying to educate and create some kind of capacity building for both the organizing authority, which we did. By the way, it's until 3 years ago that we had the first organizing authority. It is called Metropolitan. So Metropolitan Transport Authority. So you can see that there were structural problems within that. And also, you cannot blame the paratransit so much because we don't have any single training for people who operate road transport. You can't get a degree in that transport sector. And we are not as specialized as those in airline and those in rail. So you find that we are lagging behind. So we are now trying to ask whether we should not have a transport institute just to deal with capacity building for drivers. We are also asking UITP if they can set up a center of excellence in Nairobi to see if we can, because we have capacity deficit, both at the government level, policy level. We have capacity problems at the operator level, and we have the capacity level at the floor level, drivers and conductors, and the platform staff. All of them are not trained. So when you see them operating, they're just trying to do something. And they have developed what you call now the matatus culture. That culture is not one of the best. It is interesting. If some people come to Kenya, they find buses, they play loud music, they are painted with graffiti, they drive at kamikaze speeds. So all this has become a matatu culture, but I don't think all the same is a very good culture. But it defines Kenya, I think.
It's interesting, huh? Because what I remember, you correct me, please, Edwins. The name matatu means tree, and then originally it was 3 cents the cost, and then people started to call it as a tree, matatu. So is it? Do I remember correct on this?
You remember correct. It used to be mangotore matatu, which meant 3 cents. Every stage you went, flat fare. That is how the name matatu came out.
Okay, it's a very interesting culture, certainly. But of course, we are more interested in its role in the transport on this. So then maybe we talk about a little bit informal transport, and as well, you were also talking about capacity building. What are the other challenges, if you look from the perspective of the African mobility in the different cities, and what kind of other actions are needed to overcome these challenges? You already mentioned like building capacity, that's one thing, formalization, that's another thing. But what are other actions that you are seeing for African cities that they need to do for overcoming from the challenges that they are facing today?
There are many challenges in Africa, especially when we look at mobility and how we are carrying people. With matatu was even a good culture. There is another one that is coming up, which we call boda boda, which is motorcycle taxi, which is now even more difficult to control. So the challenges we have is that as time goes on, we are rolling down from the big capacity vehicles to midi buses, mini buses. Now we've gone to small. So one of the things we need to do is to have a policy framework that reverses this. So you'll find that I can start by saying the taxation regime that we have doesn't promote high capacity vehicles. So that's a challenge that we have. We also have a challenge of risk management in this. So you find there are too many risks. So the industry, as you move on, you find it becomes very difficult to insure. A lot of companies that are insuring matatus are collapsing because of increased accidents. Of course, when I mention accidents, I'm talking about the externalities that come out of matatu operation, paratransit for that matter. So there is a lot of pollution that is going on. There is a lot of congestion that those vehicles cause. There is a lot of cartels that have started emerging on different routes. No bus can go on this route, another one cannot go on this route. So zoning has started coming up, which we need to reverse. The other issue that we have is that of things like corruption. Because enforcement is so weak, the regulations, the rules are there, but the enforcement mechanisms are very bad in Africa. So all this, of course, the basic thing is that the people who are operating are not trained to operate the public transport systems in a correct way. So if you're taking somebody about operating properly on schedule, they have never seen one. So they need to be able to understand how it works, and it's very difficult to do that. Now, the issue of individualized, everybody with one unit, nobody wants to aggregate. So you're competing against each other. So the competition is stiff. And when competition is stiff, you know very well that a lot of undercutting of fares comes. And therefore, the fleet renewal program suffers. So you find the vehicles get older, they cannot be renewed. The drivers who are there are making bashes on the body of the vehicle here and there. And you find the vehicles don't look good at all. At the end of the day, there is no passenger information. So you find people shouting on the streets because there are no schedules. So touts are shouting, so passengers competing. Those externalities are things that we need to deal with as a whole in Africa. So quite a number of things, including infrastructure. We haven't developed depots, bus stations, even bus stops. Things like good terminals are missing. Dedicated lanes are not there. So these bus priority measures are places that need a lot of investment. We are hoping that the government should invite a lot of PPPs, for example, to come and start looking at how they can invest into public transport. Lastly, is the issue of technology. The level of usage of technology in paratransit is very low. And this is an area that we will need to look at and see which technologies, from automated fare collection systems, other ITS systems that we may put on board, so that we are able to improve public transport provision to the customer or to the passenger. Right now, the person who suffers is the passenger because he pays a lot of money because there are no connectivities or there are no through routes. So you find somebody has got to pay several times, takes a border from first mile, then takes a bus, then takes another bus, then takes a border. So by the time somebody reaches home, the cost of travel is very high.
And thank you, Edwins. I think it's very important, especially what you say in terms of digitalization as a tool and as a very important action. I really see the very big role for digitalization for the way forward. It will be the big game changer for the African public transport context because although despite many efforts and current strong efforts, what we see is that the digital maturity is not very high in some cities, and it will play a big role. That's what I'm believing. And also, one other area around this is electrification, and then you have launched electric buses in your company. Also, you are working on this in Kenya. And what lessons have you drawn from the first experiences, and also what does scaling electrification look like in Kenya and across Africa?
We have electrification at 3 levels. We have electrification with two-wheelers. It's doing very well. We have electrification of the private motorists, the car. It's having a bit of challenges. And we have now electrification of the public transport vehicles. We still have a lot of challenges because the vehicle is still very expensive. So we'll need to look at mechanisms, the incentives. The government, yes, I've been on the e-mobility task force, and we have made recommendations of what we need to ensure that the vehicles that are coming to operate are affordable. We're really thinking that might have to be a need to at least assemble the vehicles in the country, because then that will reduce the duty and make the vehicle affordable. We have challenges with the charging points. The infrastructure for charging is still very bad. So the vehicles we have cannot last the total bus hour of, say, 14 hours. So the vehicle, we find it has to go to the depot, the dead mileage to go to the depot to recharge before it comes. So the infrastructure for charging is still not there. Our grid is still unstable. So you find that even if you are hoping to create clean energy, yes, in Kenya, we have almost 92% of our grid is clean energy. But that cost of having the stable power and going to recharge is a barrier to getting in. The other barrier that we are having is, of course, in the technology is new. Nobody knows about it. So we're struggling to see how we can train our people to be able to understand the technology and the mechanics to repair the vehicles. This is an area. Even the drivers to drive an electric vehicle is taking time for us to do that. Another barrier is on the tariffs. We have negotiated 50% reduction on tariffs, which is good, but only at night because we have a lot of idle power during the night. So if you want to enjoy, then you have to use that power at night. The other issue that we are having is, of course, I mentioned it, range anxiety. Range anxiety is still a big problem. We are hoping that the charging stations will be proliferated because now it's still confined to cities. We don't have the intercity charging infrastructure. You can't be sure that if you are living here, you go for a distance of, say, Mombasa, a distance of 500 kilometers, that you will reach with the same battery. We are hoping the battery technology is improving, and maybe we shall start getting good vehicles that are able to cover. The other issue we are having is no company, no bank has accepted to finance because they still don't know how to deal with that risk of electric vehicles. It's an area that we will need to look at to ensure that we are able to de-risk that area so that they ensure the banks are able to give us finance. But also, that's also because we cannot get insured. Because the current system we are using is a leasing model because of the cost of the vehicle. So the OEMs that are available here are giving us vehicles to operate based on a lease. The lease sometimes gets very expensive, and people now have got to run too many kilometers to try and get the money to pay the lease, and they are struggling. So those are some of the things that we are struggling with the electric vehicles. But can assure you that the interest, the orders placed by operators, I think if I remember, we have over 500 vehicles on order, but I don't think we have more than 100 vehicles in the system yet. Because
I see it's still very initial stages where you are in terms of deployment of the electric buses in the country. And before we conclude, just I have a last question. I think it's a very important question. Also, I know long time Nairobi's authority, Namata, is working on a BRT project, launching BRT lines. Where you are on this one and how you see this for the future of the city transport?
Yes, as operators, we are very anxious because we have 5 lines that have been defined. We have been incorporated into discussing how they are going to be operated. Namata is trying to see if we can cooperatize to form a holding company that will be able to operate this. It's still into initial stages. There is a lot of resistance from operators. But just like any other place where a BRT has come in, it means that there have to be a lot of communication. People like you will need a lot of your support.
We saw this, especially in Africa, a lot, like in Reawaya for Johannesburg or Dar es Salaam, Dart. So that was the case. It was not just a technical type, but it's more about the governance, stakeholder engagement, and so on.
Yeah. So those are challenges that we are hoping, but there's so many lessons now that have been learned. The success stories are there for people to see. I'm sure the operators we started with now are very interested in doing BRT and participating in BRT. So the challenge we have is just the funding to get the BRT operation in place. But everything has been put. The 5 lines, we have offers from the European Union, we have offers from the Korean government, we have offers from other interested parties to assist us run the BRT system. So I think we are ripe. It is not fair that East Africa is struggling with BRT when Southern Africa and West Africa are doing very well with BRT. So we are feeling left out and hoping that we'll soon start our first operation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Edwins, for this enlightening conversation. Is there any final message you would like to share with our listeners before we conclude our conversation?
My message to our listeners is that there is a lot of potential for public transport in Africa. And I would like to invite organizations that are listening to this to see what opportunities, whether it's in supplying equipment or in supplying technology or in supplying capacity building. We need to look at the youthful population in Africa. There is so much opportunity, whether it is in public transport infrastructure development, technology development, capacity building, associated companies, supply of tires, supply. There is a lot of opportunities. So we would like to invite everybody else to come and participate with us, joint ventures or in partnerships to ensure that in Africa we start having a good transport system. We also deserve a good transport system.
Thank you, Edwins. It was a big pleasure to host you on the Mobility Redefined podcast. And thank you for your leadership and vision for mobility, sustainable mobility in Africa. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in for this episode. We will be back soon with more voices shaping the future of mobility in our cities.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Mobility Redefined, brought to you by Modaxo. For more insights, visit our website at mobilityredefined.com or follow us on LinkedIn. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app to stay updated with our latest episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation.